In August of 1619, the first Africans came to the Virginia colony on an English-built ship called the White Lion. The White Lion was a privateer, and on this voyage was flying a Dutch flag and carrying Dutch letters of marque, which essentially gave them permission to attack Spanish ships in the Atlantic. At this time, that would have included Portuguese ships as well, since Portugal was under Spanish control from 1580 to 1640. And indeed, it is believed to be a Portuguese ship named the São João Baptista that was carrying these Indango slaves en route to Veracruz, Mexico. After this Portuguese slave ship was intercepted by the White Lion and her sister ship the Treasurer, the slaves were then taken to Virginia to be sold to the English colonists. At this time, the slaves would have become indentured servants, since slavery was illegal in English colonies until 1642. As indentured servants, they would have had human rights not afforded to chattel slaves, and been given a 10-year work contract, at the end of which they would have been given their freedom and 50 acres of land. Now, as far as we know, these were the first African Americans, or the first Africans to come to America and stay for the remainder of their lives. There were other Africans that came to America, possibly on multiple occasions, but for certain a little more than 80 years before this, African slaves were brought to a failed colony in South Carolina, and there's been some speculation that some of those Africans may have escaped and stayed in America, in which case they would be the first African Americans. But there's no evidence of that. That's just conjecture as of now. So as far as we know, these Africans in Virginia in 1619 were the first African Americans. Obviously, this is an incredibly important moment in history, and one that deserves far more attention than it's traditionally been given until recently. African Americans have been immensely influential on the world stage. Their contributions in the arts and sciences, politics, technology, and other fields are immense. One perfect example for the purpose of this project is Ralph Bunche, who was the very first African American to win the Nobel Prize in 1950 for his part in arranging an armistice between Israel and Egypt, just 2 years after Israel was recognized as an independent state by the United Nations, which incidentally Ralph Bunche had helped to establish. He was on the 1945 UN Conference of International Organization that drafted the UN Charter. Ralph Bunche is also believed to be a descendant of John Punch, who's known as the first documented slave in English colony in America, and who's also believed to be an ancestor of Barack Obama through Obama's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham. John Punch was an indentured servant who, after running away from his master along with 2 white servants, had his indentureship extended to life, making him the first documented slave in 1642. Which, bringing us back to the 1619 story, again we understand these were not considered the first African slaves in continental America, but a very important story nonetheless, and one that should be far better known than it has been. To that end, in August of 2019, which marked the 400th anniversary of this momentous occasion, the New York Times launched a project called the 1619 Project, with the purpose, as described on their website, to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. As I see it, having researched the project extensively, there are 3 main goals of the project. The first would be to tell this and other stories about early Black Americans that haven't been given the importance they deserve before now. The second would be to examine American history as a whole from an African American perspective. And the third would be to frame this 1619 story as the beginning of slavery in America. The first 2 are both very good goals. Obviously, these stories deserve to be told, and it's always important for people to understand other perspectives and try to see things from different points of view, particularly in a multicultural society like America. So this would seem to be a great project and an important one. Unfortunately, this is a very flawed project and one that's received a fair amount of criticism and controversy in recent days, and I believe it's due to this third goal, which is to reframe this 1619 story as the beginning of slavery in America, which it absolutely is not. If the goal were to examine the origins of slavery and even to try to establish the beginning of slavery in America, this would be a great project. But it would start much earlier than 1619, and this would be a completely different endeavor, since this false premise, being accepted as fact, is the basis for the other 2 goals. The telling of American history from a Black perspective in this project is fundamentally grounded in this lie that the origins of African Americans and the origins of American slavery are one and the same. And this is a very serious problem, particularly since the project is being adopted by many states into their public school curriculums, as many of you, I'm sure, have already heard. For this reason, I've decided to make this series of videos with that goal of examining the true origins of American slavery, and I've compiled a list of 10 first regarding slavery in America. So what I'm going to do now for the purpose of this introductory video is I'm going to read this list of 10, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on any one point. On the second point and possibly a couple of the later ones, I will have to provide a little bit further detail in this introductory video. But most of them I'm just going to read the point, and then I'm going to make a couple follow-up videos, probably 3, where I break down each point or It'll probably be 3 videos of 3 to 4 points per video, and I'll break down each point and go into detail on each story, flesh out each story, give each one the attention it deserves, and provide the evidence for each point. So with that said, let's get started with our list of the first slaves in America, starting with number 1, the very first slaves in America ever, and this would be Native Americans enslaving other Native Americans. Number 2 would be the first incident of slavery involving non-indigenous peoples of America, and this would be Christopher Columbus in 1492. And like I said, the second point, there's a couple asterisks to this one, and the first would be whether or not this actually counts as slavery as opposed to just a hostage situation. Not all hostage situations are slavery. As an example, John Smith, who we know was one of the first leaders of Jamestown colony in 1607, he was captured by the Powhatan people, Pocahontas' tribe, Pocahontas' father's tribe, and he was held for about 6 weeks before he was released. And most people would not consider that incident slavery. He was not forced to do any forced labor or anything like that. He was actually enslaved by the Ottoman Turks for a year before he came to Jamestown. A lot of people don't know that story. It's a very interesting story I'll probably be telling later. And that was absolutely slavery. He was forced labor. He actually killed one of his masters while he was working in the field in order to escape. So the big difference between these two situations, the hostage situation with the Powhatan in Virginia and his being enslaved for a year, forced to perform labor in the fields in Turkey. And as coming back to the Columbus incident with the Taino were not forced into any labor. They were held by Columbus, brought back to Spain, where they were immediately freed. Queen Isabella of Spain, if any of you know much about her, she was very anti-slavery, very adamantly against slavery. The Spanish, some Spanish have been enslaved by North African Moors and Arabs for about 800 years before 1492. So it's not hard to understand why she's very anti-slavery. But as soon as the Taino arrived in Spain, and Columbus, his explanation was that he wanted them to learn Spanish and he wanted to learn their language so they could communicate better, but they were freed immediately and returned on the next ship that came back to the West Indies. So probably that's not an incident of slavery. Some of you might consider it to be, but certainly there was a lot of slavery that happened between the Spanish and the Arawak and Carib people of the West Indies in the following years, 1493 to 1495. And we'll go over all that information and nail down a specific point. The 1492 incident with the Taino and Columbus is a good place to start, though. The other asterisk under this point would be whether or not, it's another, as far as we know, situation. So as far as we know, this was the first incident of slavery involving non-indigenous peoples of America. There were certainly other non-indigenous peoples to come to America before Columbus in 1492. We know the Vikings came around the year 1000 or around the year 980. And there are a couple written records of the Vikings and their experiences in Newfoundland. There's no incident, no example of slavery from those stories. So as far as we know, it didn't happen, or we don't have evidence of that. There was also a Welsh expedition to America. There was a Welsh prince named Madoc. I believe 100, 150 years after the Vikings came. I'll get the numbers specific on that in the follow-up video, but he claimed to have discovered a new world, which we believe to be America, came back to Wales, put together a colony, and they left and were never heard from again. There is a surprising amount of evidence of Welsh activity or Welsh being in America before Columbus, and again, I'll go over all of that in the follow-up video. There's also a very high probability that Africans came to America a little after the Welsh, a couple hundred years after the Welsh. Africans from the Mali Empire under the rule of Mansa Musa in the 14th century very likely came to America. And again, we don't have written records of them in America. We have evidence of them, of an expedition leaving, and there's good probability that they came here. But as far as we know, and as far as the evidence that we have, it was the Spanish and their enslavement of the peoples of the West Indies. So moving on to number 3 would be the first incident of slavery involving Europeans in North America outside of the West Indies. This would be Gaspar Corte Real, a Portuguese explorer who visited Newfoundland in 1501, shortly after John Cabot discovered Newfoundland and mapped it out for the English. Gaspar Corte Real led a Portuguese expedition to Newfoundland and returned with 50 native slaves, probably the Beothuk people. Number 4, this would be the first African slaves brought to the Americas, and this would be 1502, when Juan de Cordoba sent a black slave from Spain to Hispaniola, which is present-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. Number 5 would be the first incident of slavery involving Europeans in what is now the U.S. This would be Juan Ponce de Leon, famous for his pursuit of the Fountain of Youth in Florida. In 1513, he captured 8 Calusa tribesmen in Florida. Number 6 would be the first incident of enslaved Africans in the modern United States, and this would be that Spanish settlement of Miguel de Gualdape in 1526. This is the failed Spanish settlement that I mentioned earlier in this video, where some people have suggested that it's possible that some of these African slaves escaped and would have been the first African Americans. Very interesting story, very important story in American history, and I'm going to go into that in detail on number 6. Number 7. This would be the first incident of slavery in what is now the U.S. involving English or Northern Europeans. This is a very interesting story. This would be the 7 Roanoke survivors, possibly 4. There's a couple different accounts of this, but the 7 survivors of Roanoke colony. Although this is unverified, it's actually considered one of the great mysteries of American history. What happened to Roanoke colony? And it's interestingly enough, there's a lot of written evidence in England. English explorers John Smith and others of his time were given accounts by Native Americans in the area of what happened to the survivors of Roanoke. The Roanoke colony was slaughtered by the Powhatan, but some of the survivors were made to work in the copper mines of their Wariatsé chief Ayanoco. Number 8. This would be the first incident of Africans in an English colony in America. And this would be one Indian and a Negro, the first these lands ever had, were brought to Bermuda in 1616 on an English ship, the Edwin, at the behest of Bermuda's second governor, Captain Daniel Tucker. And that takes us to number 9, which is the first incident of Africans in an English colony in what is present-day U.S. And this would be the 1619 story, the 20-odd Africans taken from the Portuguese slave ship, possibly Spanish ship. Most people agree that this was a Portuguese ship called the San Juan Baptista. I'll go into all the details of that on number 9. Number 10 would be the first documented African slave in an English colony in America, and this would be John Punch, who we mentioned earlier, a very important person in history, as I've already mentioned. So I'll be making those follow-up videos very soon, hopefully get them out in the next couple of days. And if any of this sounds interesting to you or something that you would like to hear any of these points, you'll know what order they're coming in, and just watch my channel and they'll be coming out very shortly.